I'm Ray 62 and the HOA fined me $2,000 for a shed I built by hand, then voted to seize it outright. They said it was a blight on neighborhood standards, even though it was tucked neatly behind my house, painted the same shade as my siding, and maintained better than half the homes on this street. The night they voted to take it, they did it during the open board meeting, and Karen, the board president, actually smiled while reading the motion. "This neighborhood deserves better than improvised backyard shacks," she said into the mic, making sure the whole room could hear her jab. Neighbors I'd helped for years sat in silence while I was humiliated. That shed meant something. It wasn't just wood and nails. I built it after I retired, poured the concrete base myself, kept all my old tools and gear organized in there. It wasn't some flimsy plastic box from the hardware store. It was a proper workspace, a piece of dignity in my backyard. But Karen saw it as an opportunity, a chance to flex her power and to parade me as an example of what happens when you don't bow to her every ordinance. I didn't make a scene that night. I stood up, nodded once, and left the meeting without a word. I walked home in the dark, thinking how strange it was that the same country I served for 24 years could allow a petty woman with a clipboard to claim my shed like it was a derelict car. And yet the bylaws said they could. The fine had stacked. The vote was public. They planned to seize it, dismantle it, and bill me for the labor. I sat in the dark that night, a whiskey in one hand, the violation notice in the other. My dog Hank laid his head on my boot like he always did when he knew I was angry. And I was, not just angry simmering. But before I tell you what happened on that day, let me explain how it all began. Before all this nonsense with the shed and the HOA started my life, here was simple, predictable in the best way. I'd retired 5 years earlier from a career in military logistics. Spent most of my working life on the move, shipping routes, supply lines, deployment schedules. Everything was built on precision timing and a lot of gray coffee. So when I finally hung up the uniform, I knew I didn't want to live anywhere flashy. Just a quiet house with a good lawn and space to breathe. I found that in Green Hill Pines. The neighborhood had been built in the early 90s, back when developers still put thought into lot sizes. I picked the last house on the corner, with a nice deep backyard and a few oaks shading the property line. Not too fancy, just right. A place where the birds nested each spring and you could hear the wind rustle before you heard a car. At first, things were peaceful. The HOA had rules, sure, but nothing outrageous. Trash bins behind the fence lawns, under control, no pink houses, that sort of thing. I paid my dues, kept my head down. I was the kind of neighbor who waved but didn't pry. If your mailbox leaned over, I'd straighten it. If your kid tossed a football too far, I'd toss it back. No big speeches, just neighborly things. About a year in, I built the shed. I wanted a place for my tools, woodworking projects, and all the retired gear I couldn't bear to part with. There's something grounding about being able to see your tools hung just right, everything where it belongs. My father taught me that, a place for everything and everything in its place. So I cleared a space in the back corner of the yard, poured the foundation, and built it plank by plank. I even matched the paint to the house. Every nail, every joint, I made sure it was solid. Not an eyesore, not some rickety thing falling apart. When I was done, I added a small flagpole beside it and planted rose bushes along the edge. That part was for my late wife. She loved roses. The neighbors didn't say a word. In fact, some of them complimented it. Mark from across the street even asked if I'd help him design one for his tools. Things were good, peaceful. That changed when Karen became HOA president. I remember the first time I met her. She showed up at my door with a clipboard and a fake smile. Said she was conducting an introductory compliance check as part of her efficiency initiative. I offered her coffee. She declined, just stood there squinting toward the backyard like she was trying to spot a crime scene. She didn't say anything about the shed that day, just jotted some notes and told me she was documenting properties with potential variances. I should have known right then. Over the next few months, I noticed her little patrols more frequently. She'd walk the block with that same clipboard, peeking into yards, sometimes even lifting her phone like she was snapping pictures. I tried to ignore it, figured maybe she was one of those retired types who needed a mission. But then came the notice. Structure non-compliant, immediate action required. They said it didn't meet setback code because it was 3 feet too close to the rear fence. Never mind that it was on my property, tucked neatly behind my house and invisible from the street. They included a $500 fine and a deadline to dismantle it. That was my first real glimpse of the machine, and Karen was greasing the gears. I appealed. I showed up to the board meeting with the site plan property survey and even a photo of the shed with measuring tape laid out. They barely looked at it. Karen smirked the whole time. She said, "We enforce aesthetics and community harmony, not just lines on paper." Aesthetics. That was her word of the year. Still, I thought maybe if I complied just enough, they'd let it go. So I trimmed the bushes, repainted the back wall of the shed, sent in a new request with updated drawings. I played it by the book. They rejected it again, added another fine. Then came the threat: failure to comply will result in legal action up to and including removal of the structure at homeowner's expense. I started to feel it then, that tightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not yet, but pressure. That old familiar sensation from deployments gone wrong. When the plan didn't make sense and you realize someone with too much power and too little experience was calling the shots. I wasn't just a man in a backyard anymore. I was back in a system that punished logic and rewarded control. And Karen, she was thriving in it. Still, I wasn't ready to go to war, not yet. But I was watching now, listening, and starting to remember the one thing no one on that board seemed to understand about me. I spent my entire life managing chaos and solving problems no one else could see. Logistics wasn't just about packages and trucks. It was about leverage, flow, timing. And Karen, she had no idea that by pushing me, she just awakened the part of me that didn't forget things. Especially not people like her. Things escalated faster than I expected. Once Karen and her crew smelled blood in the water, they went after me with sharpened teeth. Every week brought a new notice, a new fine, a new accusation. They said the shed's roof reflected light into neighboring windows. Then they said the structure disrupted backyard sightlines, whatever that meant. I swear they were inventing terms as they went along. Karen even used the phrase visual encroachment in one of the letters, as if a gray-painted shed could psychologically invade a neighbor's space. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was making an example of me. By the time the third violation letter arrived, the fines had crept over $2,000, and the wording in the letters had changed too. They'd stopped asking me to remove the shed and started saying they would. There it was in bold: should homeowner remain non-compliant, the HOA reserves the right to pursue removal and property line measures under Section 8.3b of the CCRs. Section 8.3b. I went and looked it up. It was buried in the governing documents, an old clause that allowed the board to forcibly remedy unauthorized structures if they deemed it urgent. The language was vague, and Karen knew it. She had found her loophole. Now I'll say this, I have faced bureaucracy before. You don't spend a career moving critical supply convoys through 5 different war zones without learning how red tape can twist a good plan into a disaster. But this was different. This was personal. Karen wasn't trying to protect the community. She was trying to dominate it. And I wasn't the only one in her sights. I started noticing the pattern. Susan, 2 doors down, got cited for leaving a flower pot on her front steps. Harold, the retired firefighter across the street, got fined for parking his vintage truck in the driveway instead of inside his garage. His garage was full of gear from when his son moved back in. Karen didn't care. If it didn't fit her Pinterest perfect vision, it was a violation. She was wielding the HOA rules like a ruler in a schoolroom, except we were grown adults being scolded by a woman with a laminated binder and a power complex. Still, most of the neighbors just sighed and paid the fines. They didn't want the fight. They didn't want to risk the extra stress. Me, I didn't like being pushed. But more than that, I hated being underestimated. Then came the day I found the survey flags. Little neon pink flags staked right into my lawn. A trio of them lined up beside the rear fence, and one of them sat almost directly on the corner of my shed's foundation. I called the number written on the side. The man on the phone confirmed it. The HOA had ordered a boundary survey. Karen wasn't bluffing. She was building a paper trail to forcibly seize my shed. That evening, as I stood by the back window sipping black coffee and watching the wind flick those flags back and forth, I felt something shift inside me. A kind of stillness. Not fear, not anger, just precision. I'd spent decades building routes, supply chains, contingency plans. I knew how to anticipate pressure points, knew how to use resources quietly without tipping my hand. And I realized something then, watching those flags dance like pink taunts in my backyard. Karen thought she'd boxed me in, She had no idea she just mapped out my next move. But first I needed more than emotion. I needed data, structure, weakness. So I started paying attention, not just to Karen, but to the HOA's operations, where they kept their signs, their seasonal decorations, the tools for maintenance, the mulch bags, hedge trimmers, paint gravel for the playground. I'd seen the HOA maintenance crew, two grumpy guys with ball caps and clipboards, drive a trailer over to the storage lot tucked near the tennis courts every other Friday. I'd seen the same truck, same schedule. Predictable, boring. Until I looked deeper. I walked the neighborhood with my dog, Hank Leash, in one hand, notebook in the other. I started making notes of how often the HOA maintenance lot was accessed. I took photos, logged patterns. One day I struck up a conversation with one of the part-time workers who was leaning against the truck on his break. Told him I used to run logistics. Asked where they kept backup paint and signage. He pointed vaguely behind the courts. Old tennis shed, he said. Been there since before the HOA even started. They rent the land from some private guy, I think. Private guy. That night I pulled up the county assessor's website. Looked up the parcel number for the maintenance lot, and there it was. Not owned by the HOA, not even leased officially. It was still in the name of the original developer. And the developer? He was dead. His estate had listed several small properties for sale earlier that year, including the shed lot. The listing was still up. Karen had missed it. I didn't smile when I saw it. I didn't laugh or pump my fist. I just felt that old familiar clarity. That quiet certainty you get when the route you need opens up. Clean, open road. The shed might be their battleground, but the storage lot, that was my battlefield now. The notice came by certified mail, a clean white envelope stamped with the HOA's embossed seal. Inside, printed on crisp letterhead, was a formal declaration of intent the board had voted to proceed with the removal of my shed. They claimed their legal counsel confirmed their right under the community covenants. They even scheduled a contractor to dismantle it 2 weeks from the notice date. No appeal, no conversation, just a scheduled demolition. They were treating it like junk cleanup, like my shed was some forgotten mattress dumped behind a dumpster. It was insulting, dehumanizing even. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the letter in my hand, the smell of sawdust still faint on my shirt from working in the shed that morning. I looked around at the drawings I'd sketched, the shelves I'd planned to build, the half-sanded cedar bench I'd promised my daughter. And suddenly it all felt temporary, fragile. That night I didn't sleep much. I took Hank for a long walk instead. Moonlight cutting shadows across the quiet street. I passed by homes I had helped shovel snow for, fences I had quietly repaired, front porches where I'd handed out candy to neighborhood kids. I had tried to be a good neighbor. I had never asked for much. But now my place, my little corner of peace, was under siege by a woman with too much time and too little empathy. And it wasn't just the shed, it was everything it represented: control, boundaries, dignity, my autonomy as a homeowner stripped away in a vote. 2 days later, I received a second letter. This one was worse. The HOA had filed a lien against my property. It wasn't massive, just over $2,300, representing accumulated fines and legal fees. But it was official, it was recorded, and it meant they could take me to court, maybe even push toward foreclosure if they wanted to get nasty. And knowing Karen, I had no doubt she'd float the idea just to watch me squirm. I sat there with the notice on my lap and thought, this is how it happens, huh? Not all at once, bit by bit, 1,000 paper cuts from someone who thinks the rules give them a crown. The worst part, my daughter stopped bringing the grandkids by. Not because she didn't want to, because she didn't want them to hear me angry. Didn't want them asking why Grandpa's mad at the neighbors. She was trying to keep the peace, but her absence was like a vacuum. The house was too quiet, too still. That's when Karen's pettiness took a step into cruelty. I was walking Hank near the community park when she called out from the sidewalk. You might want to start packing up your little clubhouse, she said, like she was giving me a helpful tip. We've already got someone lined up to haul it. Maybe next time follow the rules like the rest of us. That little smirk of hers, it wasn't just about the shed. It was about power. She wanted to see me kneel, not literally maybe, but to cave, to acknowledge that she ran the show, that she could take something from me and I'd just have to swallow it. But here's the thing about someone like me. You don't survive decades in military logistics by panicking. You stay calm, You think 10 steps ahead. You wait for the gap in the fence. And I already had the deed in motion. While Karen was busy playing HOA Empress, I was already negotiating with the estate agent who handled the old storage lot. I didn't walk in with fanfare. No cash-in-hand theatrics. Just clean paperwork, a modest offer, and a willingness to close fast. Within a week, the lot was mine. The irony still makes me shake my head. They were so busy looking over fences and filing notices they never thought to check their own foundation. The shed they stored, all their seasonal signage, the HOA banners, the lawn equipment, the paint, it was all on land they didn't actually own. No one had touched the paperwork in years. They'd assumed it was theirs by use alone. Classic logistical oversight. I didn't announce anything right away. I let them continue as usual for a few days. The crew came and went. The board members did their rounds. I even saw Karen at the monthly neighborhood walk nodding proudly as if the HOA's dominion was absolute. Then on a Wednesday morning, he had out a locksmith change every lock on the storage unit, replace the rusted padlocks with commercial-grade deadbolts. Then I called a local security company and hired 2 part-time guards not to stand there like rent-a-cops, but to monitor and log every attempted access. That afternoon, I posted laminated signs on the building, private property, trespassing subject to legal action. For storage access, contact property owner to discuss lease terms. And I listed my number. The call started that night, first from the maintenance crew, then from the HOA vice president, and then predictably from Karen herself. Voicemail only, her tone frosty, controlled. Mr. Ray, this is Karen Atwell, HOA president. We've been informed you've placed locks on the HOA maintenance unit. That structure contains board-owned property and is essential for scheduled community services. We expect full access to be restored immediately. This behavior may constitute obstruction of HOA operations. Please call me to resolve this professionally. I didn't call back. The next morning, the calls got angrier. A different board member, a guy named Brent, who always looked like he'd rather be golfing, left a message warning of legal consequences and reminding me of the HOA's authority under the community charter. I smiled listening to it sitting in my workshop with a cup of hot coffee and Hank snoring at my feet. I let them stew. By Friday, they tried sending someone to cut the locks. I was ready. The security team I hired, both off-duty sheriff's deputies moonlighting for extra cash, were on site before sunrise. When a local handyman hired by the HOA pulled up in a dented truck and walked over with bolt cutters, they stopped him cold. Explained the situation, showed him the posted signs and property title documents. The guy looked at the badge on their belts, looked at my laminated notice, and just nodded. He got back in his truck and left. Karen tried again later that day, this time in person. I happened to be at the lot talking with the guards when she pulled up in her Lexus like she was arriving at a court summons. She got out clipboard in hand, wearing a pink blouse and sunglasses that looked surgically fused to her face. She walked straight toward me like she owned the pavement. Mr. Ray, she said, voice clipped, you've created an illegal blockade of HOA infrastructure. You can't do this. I looked her in the eye. Actually, I can. I own the land. She scoffed. You're bluffing. I handed her a photocopy of the deed, notarized, time-stamped, and printed on official county letterhead. Her hand actually trembled a little when she took it. This is fraud, she said weakly. Nope, I replied, calm as a lake. This is logistics. She flipped through the pages and her face tightened with each line. You realize this is going to cost the HOA thousands. I nodded slowly. $4,000 a month to be exact. That's my current lease rate. You're welcome to use the building if you sign a contract. You can't be serious. I folded my arms. Karen, I was serious the moment you tried to take my shed. She left without another word. The moment she turned to go, I swear I saw something flicker in her, not just anger, but fear. For the first time, she didn't have control. That weekend, the emergency board meeting was chaos. I didn't attend, but neighbors filled me in. Karen tried to spin the whole thing as a legal misunderstanding, but the rest of the board wasn't buying it. Especially when Brent revealed they couldn't retrieve any of the fall decorations or landscaping gear for the upcoming harvest fair. Apparently, all of it was locked inside the building I now owned, and no one had the budget to replace it. I heard Susan from 2 doors down stood up and asked, how are we supposed to trust the board when we can't even trust it knows what it owns? She got a standing ovation. By Monday morning, the HOA was scrambling. They couldn't legally enter my property. They couldn't get to their own supplies. And they sure as hell weren't going to pay me $4,000 a month without a fight, but they didn't have many options left. Karen had burned their goodwill, and I had the legal high ground. I waited, just like I did when I ran convoys through terrain too rough to cross. Sometimes you don't press forward. You hold the pass. You let the other side realize they've run out of road. And that realization was coming for Karen faster than she thought. The next blow came quietly, as the most devastating ones often do. A printed letter hand-delivered to every resident in Green Hill Pines. HOA letterhead, stamped as official. But this time it wasn't Karen's name at the bottom. It was Brent's. Temporary suspension of seasonal events due to unavailable storage access. It laid out in the driest terms possible that due to an unforeseen legal dispute involving the HOA's equipment, the board was unable to access essential tools and decor for community events. There would be no harvest fair, no fall planners, no lighting installation for Halloween, no inflatables for the kids. And this part hit hardest for the neighborhood: no setup for the Veterans Day display. The very same display I helped organize last year. Karen had to stand in front of dozens of parents, elderly veterans, and ticked-off residents as they demanded answers. It was a Saturday morning board Q&A. I didn't attend, but I didn't have to. Word traveled fast. According to Mark from across the street, someone asked why the board hadn't secured the land they depended on for operations. Karen tried to deflect something about clerical errors and how she had been misled by outdated records. But neighbors weren't buying it anymore, especially when Brent, of all people, stood up and said, "Karen, we never had a legal lease. You assured us it was covered." Boom. Neighbors gasped. Someone clapped awkward at first, then joined by a few more. Karen's mouth actually hung open for a beat too long, like she hadn't expected to be called out publicly. She tried to pivot, blamed uncooperative property owners and sabotage. That's when Susan the flowerpot rebel stood and said loud and clear, "You're the one who tried to tear down Ray's shed over 3 feet. Now the whole neighborhood's paying for your grudge." I was told Karen just stood there, frozen. For the first time, she looked small. Not composed, not powerful, just a woman cornered by her own pettiness. That same day, I received a formal letter from the board. Request for negotiated access terms. They wanted to talk, not threaten, not demand, talk. I read it over slowly while sipping coffee in the shed they'd tried so hard to tear down. The place smelled of cedar and faint motor oil. I had just finished building the rosewood shelf my wife always wanted. My fingers ran over the smooth grain as I smiled. Finally, they were coming to me. But I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. I drafted my reply carefully. Lease terms $4,000 month, $1,000 refundable security deposit. Must sign 6-month agreement, paid in full before re-entry. It was a stretch, a hard ask, but I wasn't in this for fairness anymore. I was in it for poetic justice. They tried to financially crush me. Now they could live in that discomfort. 2 days later, Brent showed up on my doorstep. Karen didn't come. He looked tired, polite, nervous maybe, carried a clipboard but no arrogance. We talked on my porch. I let Hank sit beside me, a quiet sentinel. Brent didn't argue. He didn't even flinch at the price. "We just want access," he said. "We're kind of stuck here, Ray." I nodded. That was the idea. To his credit, Brent agreed. Signed the lease right there. $4,000 a month, paid directly to me. They didn't even bother readdressing the lien on my shed. A week later, I got a notice that the violation had been voided and the case closed by board vote. No apology, of course not. Karen wasn't built for that, but the silence was enough. The shed stayed. The liens vanished. The security firm stayed another 2 months until I was sure they wouldn't try anything cute. And Karen, she stopped patrolling. No more clipboards, no more sidewalk snapshots. She still walked the block sometimes, but her shoulders looked different, deflated. At the next board election, she didn't run. She claimed personal reasons. Most of the neighborhood knew better. There's something oddly satisfying about being underestimated. Most people assume logistics is just trucks and timetables. But it's more than that. It's knowing the terrain, seeing patterns before they form, anticipating weak points, and moving quietly until you're already 2 steps ahead. Karen thought she was dealing with a stubborn old man clinging to a shed. She didn't know I once orchestrated a high-altitude airlift of emergency supplies to a unit stranded in a snowstorm halfway across northern Afghanistan with no comms, no GPS, and a 4-hour window before they froze to death. A petty HOA president trying to weaponize a bylaw clause? I could handle that in my sleep. By the time the storage lot was legally mine, I had already taken steps she never saw coming. I hired a small law firm out of town, not flashy but efficient, to set up a limited liability company that would own the land. That way the paper trail didn't immediately scream, "Ray owns this." The lease agreement to the HOA, handled by a property management proxy. All legit, all tidy. She couldn't scream conflict of interest. She couldn't make it personal in front of the board. I kept my fingerprints off everything publicly. Privately, though, I watched every invoice land, every late payment reminder, every email that started with "pair our lease terms." And oh, the lease. The contract I had written was a masterpiece of bureaucracy. I didn't gouge them illegally, I was careful. But I made every clause count. Miss a payment lockout. Attempted to tamper with the lock's $500 fine. No subleasing. No external contractors without written approval. I treated them like they had treated me, except I had the paperwork to back it all up. They paid, begrudgingly, quietly. Neighbors began whispering. I could feel the tension shifting like a storm breaking. People who had once nodded politely now paused longer to chat. A few even apologized, not outright, but in the way people do when they realize they didn't speak up soon enough. Susan brought over muffins. Mark offered to repaint my front gate for free. Even Harold grumpy. Harold walked over one evening and asked if I'd teach him how to install shelving like the ones in my shed. Funny how quickly people remember you're a neighbor when the real villain steps into the light. Karen, meanwhile, started unraveling. I heard through the grapevine that she'd tried to file a complaint with the new board about the lease, said it was predatory. But they weren't buying it anymore. Not after she cost the HOA nearly $8,000 in missed events and maintenance. Her grip on the neighborhood had slipped. Her allies on the board distanced themselves. One even quietly resigned. It wasn't long after that when I noticed a "for sale" sign in front of Karen's house. No big announcement, no goodbye letters, just a discreet sign and a listing posted online. The word was she was moving closer to her daughter for health reasons. Sure, let's call it health. Truth was she couldn't walk this neighborhood anymore without passing the shed that survived her wrath, or the locked storage unit she used to control. She couldn't stand the fact that her little empire had a crack running straight through it, and that crack had my name on it. My daughter and grandkids came back soon after. I didn't say much about the whole thing, just told her it was handled. We had dinner on the porch again, laughed. I watched the kids chase Hank around the lawn while the wind rustled through the oaks overhead. And later that night, I walked into my shed, switched on the warm overhead light, and sat at my workbench. Tools lined the wall in perfect symmetry. The cedar bench gleamed in the corner. On the far shelf, the rosebush trimmings I dried were ready to press into a frame for my wife's memorial. I looked around and thought, this is mine. They tried to take it. They tried to shame me, bury me, and rules crush me with fines. Instead, I built a wall of paper stronger than their bylaws, outmaneuvered their smug assumptions, and charged them rent for the privilege of losing. I didn't win with fists, I won with foresight. And Karen, she taught me a lesson I'll never forget. When someone shows up with a clipboard and a smile, always ask who owns the land they're standing on. Planning revenge is like setting up a long-distance supply line. Every piece needs to land in the right place at the right time, quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention. That's how you win without firing a shot. And for this phase, I wasn't just out to protect my shed anymore. I wanted Karen to feel what I felt: boxed in, powerless, dismissed. The lease was just the beginning. I had noticed over the years that the HOA storage shed wasn't just used for tools. It was their lifeline. Decorations for all the community events, paint for curb numbers, power washers for sidewalk cleanings, lawn signs for neighborhood notices, all stored there. That building was their operations center, their heartbeat. I knew that if I could control access to it, I wouldn't just inconvenience them. I would bring the entire HOA to a grinding halt. So I made a phone call to a guy named Cal, a security consultant I knew from my contractor days after retirement. Cal ran a small firm of off-duty deputies who did surveillance, executive escorts, and commercial property enforcement. Real professionals. Discreet, trained. I asked him to send 2 of his best guys to oversee the storage lot. Not to confront, just to observe and document any activity. Body cams on logs kept no exceptions. Karen didn't know it yet, but every time one of her lackeys stepped near that shed, I had timestamp video of it. Next, I called the county and filed a permit request to formally designate the lot as a commercial lease property. It was tedious, Boring, paperwork heavy, but it let me attach conditions like a parking restriction and a cap on entry hours. The HOA now needed to book a 1-hour appointment window to retrieve anything from the shed. Miss the window, wait until next week. Then I put up a brand new sign, scheduled access only. Violators will be prosecuted. The board's response was predictable. Angry emails, empty threats. One of them, I think it was the treasurer, tried to bluff his way through a warning that I was interfering with a nonprofit's ability to serve the community. I sent back a one-sentence reply. You should have considered your property holdings before declaring war over a tool shed. That week, I noticed Halloween came and went without a single spiderweb strung across the main boulevard. No inflatables, no boo signs, just a few DIY efforts from residents who clearly weren't thrilled to be picking up the slack. The board looked like amateurs. Parents started asking questions in the Facebook group. Someone posted, "Did the HOA seriously lose access to its own stuff?" It got 53 likes and a few laughing emojis. But I wasn't done. I printed a full-color flyer, tasteful professional, offering my services for custom backyard sheds and workshop construction, designed to HOA code, built by hand, approved by experience. I taped one to the message board by the mailboxes. Neighbors started coming to me with questions, not just about sheds, but about Karen, about how to push back, about their own fines and citations. It was subtle but real. The balance of power was shifting. Then came the final piece of the plan. I hosted a shed warming party. Ridiculous maybe, but strategic. I sent invites to every house on my block, offered barbecue, drinks, and a tour of the infamous structure the HOA had tried to destroy. People came, more than I expected. Even Harold showed up with his grumpy grin and a six-pack. We ate brisket. Hank chased kids around the lawn. And I gave people a look inside what I'd turned that space into. Polished wood floors, organized tools, framed photos of my wife's rose garden, even a small stereo playing old Springsteen songs in the background. When people saw it, really saw it, I think they understood. It wasn't just a shed, it was memory, dignity, a symbol of resilience. Karen didn't show up, of course, but I knew she heard about it. 3 days later, I got an envelope on my doorstep. No stamp, just placed there, quietly. Inside was a single sheet, effective immediately. The HOA will cease all enforcement action related to your property. Consider this matter closed. No apology, no admission, just surrender, neatly typed. I folded it, placed it in a frame, and hung it next to my hammer rack. Petty, maybe. Satisfying, absolutely. The revenge plan wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was methodical, strategic, built like every convoy route I ever mapped, one checkpoint at a time. And by the time Karen realized what was happening, I'd already reached the final destination. When Karen finally cracked, it wasn't in the courtroom or through some screaming match at a board meeting. It happened fittingly in the exact place where she'd once held court. The monthly HOA meeting held in the Community Rec Center Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Neighbors showed up with folding chairs and weary faces, expecting the usual mix of budget drivel and compliance threats. But this meeting wasn't like the others. For starters, the storage crisis had now bled into everything. Without access to the tools and event gear locked away in my newly leased lot, the board had fumbled 3 key events: Halloween, Veterans Day, and the neighborhood fall cleanup. No signage, no supplies, no volunteers, just silence and disappointment. People had started murmuring about dues reductions and mismanagement. They weren't just annoyed anymore, they were angry. And the fire was pointed in one direction. Karen tried to open the meeting with her usual chipper tone clipboard in hand, that same fake smile voice she always used when she thought she was still in control. Let's start with the Treasury update and upcoming holiday decor plans, which we can't do. Susan cut in from the back because everything is still locked up. Right. A few scattered chuckles. Karen stiffened. Brent looked like he wanted to slide under the table. Karen shot Susan a glare but pressed on. The board is actively resolving the issue. Harold grumpy. Straight talking. Harold raised his hand. What issue exactly? You mean the one where you tried to seize a veteran's shed, lost the HOA's only storage space, and now pay him $4,000 a month to rent it back? Gasps. A few more people clapped this time. Not polite claps, real ones. Karen turned red. That is a gross oversimplification. No, Brent interrupted. It's actually accurate. Silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Brent adjusted his chair, looked out over the crowd, and exhaled. Look, we made mistakes. I made mistakes. We relied on assumptions about property rights, and we didn't do our due diligence. That's on us, but it was Karen who insisted we push the shed violation to the maximum level of enforcement. She led that vote, and now the HOA is bleeding money and the community has no trust in us. Karen turned to him shocked. Brent, you agreed. I agreed, he said, because you told us we had legal claim over the storage lot. You said it had been deeded to the HOA by the developer. That was false. Someone from the front row stood up. A younger guy, new homeowner, and I didn't know him. Wait, are you telling us the HOA never actually owned the building they've been using for a decade? Brent nodded. It was never ours. Then what the hell have we been paying for? There it was, the boil-over moment. The kind of question that doesn't get answered with a smile or a policy memo. It hangs in the air like a verdict. Karen stammered. I acted in the best interests of the community. By trying to tear down his shed, someone else asked. You dragged a man who served this country through the mud over 3 feet of fence line, and now we're all paying for it. People were nodding now, arms crossed, heads shaking. The board sat motionless. Karen was alone at the table, isolated, exposed. She cleared her throat. I think it's clear that perhaps my leadership is no longer welcome. No kidding, someone muttered. She stood gathering her papers with shaking hands and muttered something about needing time with family. She didn't even finish the sentence before she was halfway to the door. No applause. No thanks for her service. Just the quiet scrape of the door shutting behind her. The meeting resumed without her. Brent took over, and to his credit, he didn't dodge anything. He answered questions, promised reforms, and opened the floor to new board candidates. By the end of the night, neighbors were still mad, but there was something new in the room of relief. The tyrant was gone. That weekend, Karen's house went dark. No porch lights, no dog walking patrols, no more of her stalking past yards with her judgmental glare and legal pad. A few days later, a sold sign appeared in her lawn. Her Lexus vanished from the driveway. Word spread that she'd moved to live with her daughter out in Palm Desert. Good. The next board meeting was almost pleasant. Brent announced that the HOA had restructured the lease with my LLC for a more sustainable rate, with a few conditions I had no problem signing off on. In return, they formally withdrew all pending actions against my property and acknowledged my structure as grandfathered and compliant under the current code. But the best moment came at the very end. Susan proposed renaming the storage lot. A few people laughed at first, thinking she was joking. Then she said, I think it's time we stop calling it the old tennis shed and start calling it what it is, raise rightful revenge. More laughs, real ones. A few cheers. I waved it off. Let's not get carried away. But Brent smiled and said, the motion's been made. All in favor. The vote was unanimous. I didn't need the name. I had the deed. But I won't lie, it felt good. With Karen gone and the neighborhood breathing easier, I expected things to settle into a quiet rhythm again. That's all I ever wanted, peace, privacy, and a little room to build things with my hands. But revenge doesn't just ripple outward, it echoes. The fallout from Karen's downfall didn't just affect her. It revealed how deeply her control had infected the board, the rules, and the way neighbors treated each other. People had been walking on eggshells for years, afraid that putting out a wrong-size flower pot or leaving a trash bin out past noon would cost them money or worse, humiliation. Now they were waking up. The new board, led by Brent, didn't waste time. The first thing they did was hold a review of the HOA's enforcement record. They found over 70 violations issued during Karen's presidency that were, in Brent's words, more about taste than law. Many of those were overturned or refunded. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it sent a message things were changing. Then came the audit. Apparently, while Karen had been obsessing over fences and paint colors, she'd also been playing fast and loose with community funds. Nothing outright criminal, not that I could tell, but there were irregularities, vague consulting charges, duplicate invoices, a local contractor billing for equipment rentals from companies that didn't exist. Brent brought in an outside auditor just to be safe. Transparency became the new buzzword. Neighbors started talking to each other again. I saw Harold teaching a teenager how to edge a lawn. Susan started a small garden club. The Facebook group shifted from petty complaints to potluck invites. It was like the fog had lifted. As for me, I got busy. With the lease money still coming in from the HOA's use of my storage lot, I decided it was time to reinvest in the neighborhood in my own way. I used part of the funds to expand the shed, Added a second bay with large windows, custom cabinetry, and even a drafting table for my grandkids to draw at when they visited. I also upgraded the fencing around the lot and installed motion-activated lights not for show but to keep things secure. I treated it like a responsibility now. Funny how something I didn't even want 6 months earlier had become part of the neighborhood's infrastructure and a symbol of standing your ground. One afternoon, Brent stopped by unannounced. I was in the middle of replacing hinges on the back gate when I saw him walking up with a clipboard and a nervous look on his face. "Easy," I said, holding up my hands in mock surrender. "No more fines, right?" He laughed, but it was tentative. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something." He explained the board was considering adding a new committee, one focused on homeowner engagement and oversight. They wanted someone level-headed, respected, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge bad policy. I stared at him for a long moment. "You want me to join the HOA?" Brent looked sheepish. "Not the board, just an advisory role. Give input, help us keep things balanced." The old me would have shut that down immediately, but something had shifted in the last few months. I'd spent years dodging involvement to protect my peace, but I realized that peace only lasts as long as people are willing to stand for it. "I'll think about it," I said, "but I'm not putting on a tie." "You don't have to. Just bring that common sense." I never joined officially, but I did show up to meetings after that, sat in the back, listened, asked questions when things didn't make sense. It kept the new board honest, and the neighborhood started holding them accountable without hostility, just attention. Karen never returned. The house was bought by a young couple who didn't even know the story. I thought about telling them once, but I didn't. They deserved a fresh start. Still, every time I passed their yard and saw the shed she once tried to destroy, standing tall, freshly painted, with a new trellis blooming with rose vines, I couldn't help but feel it. Not just satisfaction, not just victory. Peace. The kind that doesn't come from winning a fight. The kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground, held your dignity, and outlasted the storm. Peace, as it turns out, is quieter than you expect. It doesn't arrive with applause or dramatic music. It just slips into the room one day, steady, grounded, and makes itself at home. After months of chaos, my days returned to a rhythm I'd almost forgotten I loved. Morning coffee on the porch, Hank stretched out in a sunbeam, tools humming in the shed by mid-morning, the occasional neighbor dropping by for advice or a story. The kind of life I'd envisioned when I bought this house long before Karen ever circled my shed with her clipboard like a vulture scouting a carcass. But something was different in me now. Before, I just wanted to be left alone. I thought solitude was the same as safety, that avoiding conflict meant preserving peace. But this whole ordeal, from fines to fake violations, leans to legal victories, taught me that silence is its own kind of surrender. That if you don't defend your peace, someone else will take it and justify it with policy. So no, I didn't go back to the version of myself that stayed invisible. I was present now in little ways. Helping Harold fix a cracked retaining wall. Coaching a single mom 2 blocks over through the permit process for her carport. Sharing building plans with Mark, who finally decided to build his own shed. Funny thing, that shed the one Karen nearly dismantled my life over had become a symbol. A local landmark of sorts. People started calling it the fort. I never encouraged it, but I didn't stop it either. I even found a little brass sign left leaning against it one morning. "Respect the fort built to last." No name, no signature, just the kind of small-town poetry that makes you smile in your chest. The board kept its promises. Brent and the new members revised the enforcement handbook. They removed the most punitive fines, built in a clearer appeal process, and launched a quarterly review of all violations. I sat in on those sessions now and then, gave my 2 cents, reminded them what it looks like when enforcement turns into ego. Karen's ghost lingered only in paperwork memos signed during her reign, bylaws amended in her image. But those were being rewritten too slowly but surely, and every revision felt like scrubbing her fingerprints from the walls. But there was one moment, one quiet, unexpected moment that truly marked the shift. It was just before winter. I was out front replacing a worn section of the garden bed edging when a young boy on a bike stopped at the end of my driveway. He looked about 10, striped shirt, scuffed shoes, helmet a size too big. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the shed with that quiet, reverent awe only kids have. "You build that?" he finally asked. "I did," I said. "It's cool." I nodded. "Thanks." He squinted. "My mom says it used to be in trouble." I smiled at that. It was, but not anymore. He nodded solemnly like that made perfect sense. Good, because it looks like it should stay. He rode off after that. No fanfare. Just tires clicking over the sidewalk. But that stuck with me. It looks like it should stay. That right there was it. Legacy doesn't always come from grand gestures or press conferences. Sometimes it comes from a 10-year-old recognizing that something built with care deserves to remain standing. I spent the rest of that afternoon trimming back the rose bushes, humming a tune I couldn't place. And later, in the quiet glow of sunset, I sat on the bench inside my shed, looked out over the backyard I had fought so hard to keep whole, and finally exhaled. The fight was over, and I was still standing. A few months after the dust settled, I stood in front of the old HOA storage lot, the same one they used to treat like their private fortress, with a shovel in my hand and a half-dozen neighbors by my side. Brent was there, gloves on, trying to figure out how to dig without throwing his back out. Susan brought coffee and pastries. Mark wrangled a tiller he'd borrowed from a cousin. Even Harold showed up grumbling about his knees while helping spread mulch. We were building a garden, not just any garden or community one. The idea had come up casually at a board meeting, almost like a joke. We're paying rent on the lot anyway, Brent had said. Might as well do something the neighborhood can actually use. I offered to donate the lease back under one condition: it had to be more than a patch of soil with a sign. It had to mean something that lasted. That's how we came up with it, the Veterans Garden. It was more than fitting. This neighborhood, like most, had its share of quiet heroes. Veterans from Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. People who came back and tried to live normal lives in homes with porches and rice and vegetable patches. People who, like me, wanted peace and found themselves fighting invisible wars with paperwork and power-tripping HOA presidents. We broke ground that weekend, cleared the gravel, laid pathways with stone-built raised beds. A neighbor's teenage son painted a mural along the side of the building, a flag, a blooming rose, and a quote, "Service is rooted in the quiet work we do for others." We planted tomatoes, rosemary, squash, and climbing beans. Roses too, of course. I insisted. Every time I walk past it now, there's someone out there. Tending, watering, chatting. A small miracle in the middle of suburbia. The shed still stands in my yard, the same spot, stronger than ever. The rose vines I planted for my wife have grown thick, climbing the trellis and blooming bright every spring. Sometimes I catch a neighbor pausing on their walk just to admire it. Sometimes I offer them clippings to grow their own. The HOA still sends newsletters, but they read differently now. Less like warnings, more like invitations. Brent's still on the board, but it rotates more frequently, new voices, younger families stepping up. There's a balance now. Not perfect, but healthier. And Karen, she's become the cautionary tale. Not out of spite, but as a lesson. A reminder that control without compassion collapses under its own weight. I keep her final violation notice in my shed, pinned above the workbench, right next to the framed lease, and a photo of my wife standing next to the rose bushes the summer before she passed. That wall reminds me why I fought. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for peace. The kind you earn, the kind you protect. If there's a legacy leave it behind in this neighborhood, I hope it's this. Stand your ground when someone tries to bully you with rules. Learn the system better than they do. Use it if you must, but never let it harden your heart. Build things that last. Roses, relationships, a good shed, and never underestimate the power of quiet resistance. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in the face of control is to keep building and to never ever move your shed. Looking back, it still amazes me how something as ordinary as a shed became the spark for everything that followed. I didn't set out to make a point or stage a rebellion. I just wanted a quiet place to work with my hands to stay connected to the parts of life that felt steady. But in trying to take that from me, Karen exposed something bigger, the way small positions of power can grow monstrous when left unchecked. I've learned that control wears many faces. Sometimes it's wrapped in polite language, hidden behind policy and procedure. Sometimes it shows up, smiling clipboard in hand, insisting it's just enforcing the rules. But it's never about the shed. No. Not really. It's about someone needing to feel taller by making someone else smaller. The irony is, I never raised my voice once. I never slammed a door or threatened a thing. I let them keep talking while I got to work. While they pushed paper, I poured concrete. While they plotted, I planned. And when the time came, I didn't fight them with fire. I buried them with facts, deeds, signatures, and good timing. That's the kind of revenge I believe in. Not bitter, not loud, but lasting. And now my life's not just back to normal. It's better. I've got friends I didn't have before. A community that feels like just that, a community. The Veterans Garden stands where a forgotten storage shed used to rot. Kids help pull weeds. Neighbors bring extra tomatoes to share. And every once in a while, someone new moves in and hears the story. Most of them laugh and say, "Wait, you're that guy." I just smile. Yeah, I tell them. That was me. They always ask how I stayed so calm through it all. And I always say the same thing. I spent my whole life building systems. Turns out the HOA is just another one. The shed's still here, the roses are blooming, and as long as I've got breath in me, I'll keep building things worth protecting. Because in the end, that's what we're all trying to do, isn't it? Build something that lasts. A few months after the dust had settled and the shed saga was firmly behind me, I found myself tangled in a new kind of mess, not one of bylaws or boundary lines, but of noise, pride, and a man with too many tools and not enough patience. His name was Brad, mid-40s, recently divorced, recently moved in, and newly determined to make his mark on the neighborhood whether we wanted it or not. He bought the house 2 doors down from mine. Nice corner lot, long neglected. The lawn was yellowed and patchy, the gutters drooped like tired eyelids, and the fence leaned like it had given up. I figured he'd settle in slowly, maybe fix a few things, ease into the rhythm of the neighborhood. Instead, within a week, he had scaffolding, power washers, 2 rented dumpsters, and a massive Bluetooth speaker that blasted classic rock from dawn until the mail arrived. Now, I like a good Springsteen track as much as the next guy, but not at 6:30 in the morning with a circular saw screaming over it. Brad was working on that house like it owed him money. Loud, relentless, and proud of it. Hammering at night, sanding during dinner, shouting at contractors over speakerphone, as if the entire block needed to be part of his renovation timeline. At first, I gave him grace. We've all needed a fresh start. I figured he was working through something. But after 3 weeks of drywall dust floating onto my tomatoes and foreigners shaking the hinges off my windows, I walked over one evening to talk. He answered the door shirtless, coated in sweat and sawdust, holding a Coors. Before I could say a word, he grinned and slapped me on the back. "Ray heard you were the guy who told off the HOA queen. Respect, man." I blinked. "Thanks. Look, I just wanted to talk to you about the noise, the music, the power tools, maybe dial it back a bit after dinner hours." Brad laughed, took a sip. "Come on, man, it's progress. This house was a dump before I got here. I'm improving the whole street." I kept my voice level. No one's mad about the work. But there's a way to do it without waking up the block every morning. He shrugged. "Well, I've got a timeline. Divorce clock's ticking. Got to make this place mine fast." You know how it is? I did not in fact know how it was, but I nodded politely and left hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. Over the next 2 weeks, things got worse. Brad rented a power sprayer and stripped the paint off his siding at 10:30 at night. He blasted music during weekday lunches. At one point, he had 2 jackhammers going at once in his driveway. I could see neighbors starting to crack subtle things like closed blinds during the day, extra long walks to get the mail. No one wanted to confront him, though. They were afraid of sparking another HOA saga. So I invited Brad over for a beer. He showed up loud, same Coors in hand, laughing before he crossed the lawn. I poured him something stronger and led him into the shed, my sanctuary. Quiet, organized. The hum of a small fan, the scent of cedar and linseed oil. I watched his shoulders drop the moment he stepped inside. "Wow," he said. "This is a real shop. Clean, serious." I nodded. Took years to build it right. He wandered through, running his fingers along the edges of shelves and tools. "I've been trying to build something like this in my garage, but nothing fits. It always ends up a mess." "You've got too much gear and no plan," I said gently. "You're building chaos." He didn't laugh this time. "I just want to get ahead," he muttered. "My ex got the nice house. I got this fixer-upper and a busted riding mower." I could see it then. The noise, the frenzy, the sawdust, and shouting. It wasn't about the house. It was about control, about proving something to himself. I walked over to the corner and pulled down a rolled-up plan, a basic layout for an efficient, space-saving garage workshop. Pegboard wall, vertical storage, sound dampening. I handed it to him. "Start with structure," I said. "Chaos fixes nothing. Neither does waking the whole street to prove you're doing better." He looked at the drawing like I'd handed him a map out of a forest he didn't realize he was lost in. Thanks, he said quieter now. The next week, the noise dropped by half. Brad moved his tools inside. He started playing music at a reasonable volume, mostly blues now, not arena rock. He even knocked on Harold's door and offered to patch a crack in the old man's driveway. Word got around that he'd apologized to Susan for the construction debris near her hydrangeas. A few days later, he showed up at my shed with a six-pack and a notebook. Asked if I'd show him how to organize his tool wall. Said he wanted to build something steady, not just flashy. We spent the afternoon swapping stories, measuring boards, and drinking in the smell of sawdust and quiet accomplishment. I never filed a complaint, never called the board, just offered a blueprint. Sometimes people don't need punishment, they need a path.